The most critical campaign in the fight for voting rights took place in Selma, Alabama in 1965 when MLK joined the drive. Soon after, Congress began to consider voting rights legislation. After the murder of marcher Jimmy Lee Jackson on February 26, 1965, the 50-mile march from Selma to the state capital of Montgomery was planned. It was set to happen on March 7th and to be led by Hosea Williams of SCLC and John Lewis of SNCC. The 600 marchers were not met by police as they walked through the town on the west side of the Edmund Pettus Bridge because Chief of Police Wilson Baker and the mayor Joe Smitherman, both white, were not opposed to the march. When the marchers reached the east side of the bridge, they were up against the Alabama Highway Patrol, the Dallas County Sheriff's Office, and a number of private citizens, many on horseback, who were part of Jim Clark's posse. This is when the violence arose. The day became known as Bloody Sunday. Jim Clark was the sheriff for the Dallas County Sheriff's Office. He is known for his notorious use of violent tactics and intimidation of blacks. Clark and his deputies used cattle prods and billy clubs on blacks at civil rights demonstrations. Jim Clark was for white supremacy and wore a small button reading "Never" as a symbol of his disapproval of black civil rights.
It was the sheriff, Jim Clark, was a rabid segregationist, and could be a really mean person. I grew up knowing him as my father's boss, and he was always really nice to me, but he could be a very mean person. And he believed firmly in segregation. So he had these badges that say "Never," made up, and I even tried to clean this one off a little bit, and it's sort of like permanently dirty. And so he would give them to people. He'd have them in his pocket and reach out. So I gave it to my mother one day, and she came home, and it was something that people wore around town all the time. So it was almost like, you know how people now wear pink ribbons or different kind of ribbons for cancer, and so you look at it and you automatically know that's a pink ribbon for cancer awareness. So everybody, when they saw these, automatically knew that meant never segregate, never allow black people the right to vote. So it was something my mother wore. I had never seen that many people at one time. Selma was a fairly small town, and you didn't see people all together except maybe at a football game or something like that. And so I'd never seen that many people. And a lot of the people who walked by were people who had come into town. You remember the first time they went over to the bridge was when Bloody Sunday happened. And that so appalled people all over the country that many people came from other places. Political leaders, religious leaders, academicians came from all over the country to join with the effort and to show support.
Jim Crow laws were passed by southern states in order to create a new social class in the South. By 1914, laws adequately created two separate social classes, one black and the other white. Blacks and whites were unable to ride together in the same rail car, sit in the same parts of restaurants. Also, blacks were excluded from beaches, swimming pools, public parks, picnic areas, and also hospitals. In 1954, the United States Supreme Court struck down segregation in public schools. Rosa Parks' refusal to give up her bus seat to a white man in 1955 triggered intense protests from blacks and concerned whites. In 1956, a boycott desegregated the city buses after blacks refused to use buses for transport. Lasted almost a year. In Greensboro, North Carolina, black college students seated themselves in white-only restaurant counters. The whites began to distrust the blacks because they thought there was an unspoken pact, an agreement, or contract. Whites believed that blacks had a certain role in society, and now with blacks standing up for themselves, they couldn't understand why. This caused turmoil in both white and black communities. The civil rights movement began in order to help grant equality for all.
I remember one time being in church, and our church was segregated. There were no black people who attended our church. And there were always a couple who would stand at the back, who would be greeters for the day. And it was typically a husband and wife. And I remember one Sunday there being sort of every 6-foot man we had in church standing at the back greeting. And I said something to my grandmother about how odd that was. Well, the rumor had been that the black people were going to try and integrate different churches around town, come and worship with different churches around town. And so these very tall men were back there to prevent that. And I remember thinking to myself, I don't understand why that's a bad thing. I don't understand why, if black people want to come worship with us on Sunday, why that's such an awful thing and why they should be prevented from that. So for me, civil rights is human rights. And it means that all people are given the same opportunities and the same responsibilities to be able to succeed in life. So I think that the success of the civil rights movement led, I hope, to that broadening of an idea of what that meant, that it wasn't just black people having a right to vote and black people having a right to live where they chose and go to school where they chose and to have decent jobs, but for all people.
The quality of life for blacks has improved tremendously since Selma's Bloody Sunday 50 years ago. Blacks are able to pick a profession they find intriguing, attend school where they want, eat and sit in restaurants where they want, and vote for the candidates of their choice. Despite this progress, our nation continues to deal with the bitter realities of racism. The recent events in Ferguson, Missouri emphasize how much work still needs to be done when it comes to racial problems in the United States. The fight still isn't over.
400%. Sarah, 400%? Something like that? It's trite. It sounds trite when you say it. Some of my best friends are people of color now. It changed my way of looking at people, and I'm much more intent now at looking at individuals and honoring individuals, but I hope I'm also less inclined to look at people that I don't know or groups of people that I don't know, that I don't have experience with, and make assumptions and judgments about them without taking the time to know them. And so, as I said, I think that brings forward now to things like people who are immigrants, people who are Muslim, people who are in the LGBT community, all of those kinds of things that now are some of the people who 50 years ago might have been part of a civil rights movement if there had been such a thing.